Hey folks, this is Nick with Bootstrap Farmer. Today we're going to be talking about growing longer with seasonal extension tips for market gardeners. This was a live webinar that we shot a few days ago with some people asking questions at the end to really tailor it to their needs. And so in this, we're going to show you what the pros do and how to use that if you're a beginning farmer growing for profit, or if you're a home gardener that just wants to use some of those techniques and tools that the pros use to grow year-round. Hey everybody, we're going to start with the grow longer with seasonal extension tips for market gardeners, although we are going to leave a lot of room if you're just starting or if you're doing this for home. We're going to see how a lot of those lessons are applicable. So the goal for this webinar is we're going to learn how market farmers approach the growing season and boost their income by carefully selecting the right seeds, first and foremost. And then we're going to understand how these farmers use tools like low tunnels, frost blankets, and hoop houses to protect their crops and extend their growing season. And then we're going to learn how new growers and home gardeners can apply these techniques to scale up year over year. So just real quick, a Bootstrap Farmer, if you don't know, we're a very odd company in that we do manufacture our own trays right here in the U.S., so the pots, the trays, the things most people are familiar with. And then we also are unique, and then we also have a full metal line that we also manufacture ourselves, and that's all in Northeast Texas. And we warehouse out of Paris, Texas, so centrally located. Just a little behind the scene, this is the fabrication shop where they're making the hoop houses. That top big picture is one of our molds for the microgreen trays. And then we also make a number of tools like the hoop bender. It's behind me, and this one's out at Paris Natural Farms. We have by far the best customer service in the industry. This is some of our folks. We have both customer service that takes care of your daily need. Hey, I need to place an order. Where's my order? That kind of thing. And then we also have a dedicated tech team that works Monday through Friday, but like on the weekends for emergencies. And we are unique in that we do answer the phone 7 days a week. I am Nick Burton. Don't want to talk about myself too much. That picture is not me, but that's why I aspire to be when I retire. And basically, here at Bootstrap Farmer, I kind of head up all the videos, the media, but I'm surrounded by a very robust team that helps me do all that. I just happen to be the mug that's on the camera. But I do have 6 years of soil and hydroponic farming that I did in Paris, Texas with ready-to-eat meals, pop-up events, and a mocktail food truck that we sourced all this stuff right on my own farm. And over the last 10 years, I'm closing in on about 900 interviews with farmers and farm visits in 43 states. So I've got a lot of context for what we're talking about. I do want to introduce Ricky Chadwick, who's going to be monitoring the tech. If you have like some general questions, feel free to ask them along the way, and she's going to be getting to those. And if it's something that she wants either myself or my co-host Randy to cover, we're going to cover that at the end. But Randy Cummings, been in the industry, I'm going to go ahead and say about 15 years unless he corrects me, and he's been a great friend of mine when I was farming. That's how we met, and he came with me with when I came over to Bootstrap. So that's everybody you're dealing with. This is one of our hoop houses, about 40 minutes from our Paris, Texas location. Again, we're just going to go over some basics right now in that there's an economic driver specifically for market farmers, and I'm going to cover home gardeners here in a second, but it allows us to extend the growing season for continuous crop production and sales. And so from a market gardener standpoint, that means there's rarely a dip in the sales unless they don't have a place to distribute, but that's for another webinar. But that increased crop yields, the diversity of crops available during off-peak seasons means that you're able to grow more pounds, which equal more money, and the quality is oftentimes a lot better because you're not dealing with some of the things that, if you're not protecting the crops, things that might pop up like leaf burn, things like that. And then you also, in the off-season, have a chance to really shine as you get new clients and then demonstrate to your current clients that, hey, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. And that means a lot come the next spring whenever they start shopping again real hot and heavy. So higher market prices for fresher produce in winter when supply is limited. We've got a supply and demand issue. Reduced risk of crop loss due to adverse weather. We all, and no matter where you're sitting at right now listening to this, I'm guarantee you've had some crazy weather this year, or at least have had some regional crazy weather. I don't think that's going to get any better anytime soon. So giving yourself a little bit of insurance with some of the techniques we're going to talk about in this should get you a long way in your production. So we're also going to talk about improved cash flow and consistency throughout the year. So again, being able to make sales week after week, often at a higher price point, often with stuff that your neighbors at the farmer's market or wherever else may not have, it's a big deal. It's also an opportunity to cultivate specialty or niche crops that can thrive in protected environments. And Randy reminded me to talk about, we're going to go over some of those things, that what does it mean for a seed to be under protected cover. But continuing on with this the enhanced ability to meet local demand for fresh, locally grown produce year-round. You know, if you've been to a farmer's market off-season or at the tail end of the season, it's usually pretty slim pickings. So to be able to meet the demands of the clients that still are there, I don't like a competition mindset at the farmers markets, but the more you can service your customers and give them a reason to come back and bring their friends, it's going to trickle down and help the market long term. So go ahead and be that market leader. It's a potential to reduce the heating costs by using passive solar energy in a hoop house. I am not going to talk about heaters in this at all. Everything we're going to do is that passive heating, generally using the sun or protecting against the frost. So strengthening the relationships with customers and markets by providing the reliable produce supply. Now, if we take a look at the economic driver from the home grower perspective, you're extending that harvest season and you're reducing the need to buy produce, or at least restrict how much you're going to have to buy. Again, just like the market gardener may be able to grow some niche crops, you're going to be able to grow a wider variety of vegetables in the winter. And you're going to grow fresh produce year-round, improving your own food security. Cut your grocery bills by growing your own food and depend less on external food sources, and I know that's very important to many of us. And you also can experiment with new crops and growing methods. Improved home food preservation with a constant access to fresh produce, and enhanced self-sufficiency in sustainable food production, and getting out of boring food menu ruts. And all of us have that problem where we tend to cook the same thing over and over again, especially in season. This is your chance to do something new that maybe your family hasn't seen before. Overarching concepts for the webinar, we're just going to talk about seasonal extension basics. This farm, this picture was taken a couple of years ago in the rare snow that we had in Paris, Texas at Paris Natural Farms. And so the general concept is we're going to work with the season. We're not going to work against it. YouTube sometimes is sensationalized in, hey, there's a guy in Nebraska growing oranges in the wintertime and thousands of pounds and hundreds of pounds. And that's a very popular video. It's an old video. It's been on YouTube a long time. But I do think, and I bring that up because I've heard it so many times when I go to give speeches or we're at a conference or something. This constantly gets brought up with our tech people. You know, how can we grow tropicals in the wintertime? And that's still working against Mother Nature. So we're trying to grow, and we're going to cover this seed selection multiple times during this because it's such a valuable piece of information to tuck under your hat. So we're only going to be talking about growing vegetables that grow in season in your region. And again, we're choosing crops that are going to grow in the cold and that are going to perform well in the cold and not just kind of stagnate. They're going to thrive. They're going to get sweeter, tastier, that kind of thing. We're also going to be thinking about growing regionally. And I say think old school menus because a lot of times, you know, our grandmas or great-grandmas, if you grow up in a cooking household, they're using vegetables like turnips and rutabagas and the winter squash and things like that don't typically work their way into the modern kitchen these days as much as I would like for them to happen, including my own, so I'm guilty of that too. But these old school regional menus were done by people before, during the Depression, slightly after the Depression, until the housing market picked up. And these people, they saved their seeds year over year, and they made sure that they always had a constant supply through years of working the soil, working the land, having a family garden, having a victory garden back in the 40s, and being able to supply those vegetables that were thriving at that time for their region. And we're also reducing the food miles for freshness, nutrition, and environmental benefits. So anytime, I don't have to tell any of you here, if you're here, you're interested in this kind of thing. So having something you pick for yourself or a neighbor that's growing that for you versus going to the store, beating a dead horse, right? So then we also get, that's pre-equipment. That's just getting your mind right in the proper selection and thinking about what are we going to do with these vegetables in the kitchen. So when we talk about equipment, and this is not a sales webinar or anything like that, I'm just covering what we have. Crop protection infrastructure, low tunnels, frost blanket, very basic, very easy to get into without a high cost. And then we can expand our growing zone with unheated hoop houses and cat tunnels, and then bring in that crop protection from frost blankets and low tunnels to further give us some protection inside of the hoop houses. So again, just some general concepts to get in your mind as we go throughout the webinar. Most of you have seen this. If you haven't, we have a fairly recent video of the USDA plant hardiness zone map, and that basically says, hey, if you live in this area, you can dial it down by finding your address in that top left-hand corner whenever you go to that USDA website and find out, hey, when is that frost date going to hit? For some of you, that's already happened, and for many of us, it's happening very soon, or it's going to be happening within the month. For some of the people, let's say 10, 11, 12, so we're taking anything south of Dallas, some California, some for sure Florida. They still have to do adjustments. Even though they're not going to have a freeze, they can expect a little bit of yield decline. So what does that mean? They may change their variety a little bit. And again, that variety selection creeps in even if you're not going to have a frost danger. Some of those considerations, again, I'm going to say it 100 times on here, that proper crop selection. This is a fun time of year. You can get out those seed catalogs, look at something you want to try. You don't have to order, a million seeds to try just a little small plot or a small row. It's a good time to be planting. The next picture I have is a good example of a low tunnel. This was in North Carolina about 2018, I believe is when I took this. And it also shows that irrigation. And that's a reminder that you still need to irrigate these crops in the wintertime. But we also have to make sure we're protecting that irrigation infrastructure from freezes. So making sure if we do think a freeze is going to come, we're draining the lines, that kind of thing. A lot of people associate fans with, dissipating the heat. And if it's in the wintertime, why would we want to get heat out of there? Just keep in mind that in some of your lower regions or even in the north, if it is a particularly sunny day or we have a little bit of warm spike, all that cold air that has been building up, the ambient temperature, as soon as that sun hits, it's going to raise up the humidity level. Humidity brings all kinds of problems with your crops or potential problems. So being able to still, even in the dead of winter, vent out that hoop house, especially at the center part of the day, is very important. And I'm going to cover this picture with Tracy Lutz, Kansas Garden Guy on YouTube, pretty extensively here in a bit. Right now. So again, Tracy Lutz, Kansas City Garden Guy, dear friend of Bootstrap Farmer, and he's really, really come a long way over the last couple of years. But this year in particular, he's really, really doing a lot of big things on his farm. So check him out. But there's a lot going on in this picture that kind of encompasses everything we've been talking about to this point. Frost blanket. He's doing that microclimate even though he's in the hoop house. Mulch. He is protecting his walkways from when he irrigates, he's keeping things dry. He's keeping mud down. One of the things I love about Tracy is it's always immaculate. You see here, this is what everybody wants their farm to look like. It rarely happens. It takes a lot of work, and he's really good at it. But that mulch, it's suppressing the weeds. It's keeping things dry. But more importantly, it's breaking down over time, and it's helping to insulate the roots. So protecting the roots is just as important as protecting the leaves, if not more, because that's where the plants are kind of storing their life cycle in there. And again, crops. If we take a look at this was taken, I believe, the year before last, right in the dead of winter. He's got a nice crop of crisp Salanova going on, which is perfect for this time of year. That's a type of lettuce, if you don't know. He still has that ventilation option. So at the time, he didn't have a fan in here, but he was still able to draw in that fresh air to bring that humidity level down if he needed to. And, of course, he's under the hoop house, which means hoop house film. Some of you may choose to go a double layer. Some of you may not want to do or not be able to do a cat hoop house, but you do have a cat tunnel option. And you still have the option to do hoop house film with a low tunnel in some specific instances. Most important thing is the experience of this farmer. This is not a year one farmer. Tracy had been in it for 2 to 3, if not more years at this point. And that's something that as you start growing, that these lessons that you're going to learn over time by listening to whoever you're going to listen to, but your main thing that you're going to learn is just going out and getting dirt on your hands. And let's never forget that experience goes a long way. So yes, no, maybe. Are we going to do any frost protection? Are we going to go all out and buy a hoop house? I just want to cover a few things. The picture on the left is at J.M. Fortier's garden that we visited last October. This is a good example of far north. I don't know what zone it's in, but it's just south of Montreal. And again, this was late October when we went, and that's a very thriving garden of herbs that have been planted. They're perennials. They're going to be able to take the cold, and he has plans in place, of course, to switch those out. Honestly, I don't exactly remember where this one was, but you see those low tunnel hoops with the frost blanket, with the snap clamps. It's the middle of the day, so they're able to take the frost blanket off and kind of vent, and that's ready to be deployed at night. top picture on the right is a caterpillar tunnel, again, at Paris Natural Farms. Nice succession plants of lettuce. He's real well known for his greens, cut and come again type of thing. And then again, a hoop house about 40 minutes away from Paris that this guy is going to be growing year-round for his market in Greenville, Texas. In-ground, low cost of entry, right? You can kind of grow anywhere, food production. You're growing with what you have, and it really forces that proper crop selection with the season. So if you're thinking about growing tomatoes and it's going to snow this year, there's going to be time when it gets too cold, those tomatoes are going to cash out. Let's go ahead and start cycling those out, getting plants changed out, getting seeds started, thinking about succession planting. It happened with our ancestors. It happened with 3 or 4 generations and longer ago that they didn't have some of the stuff that we have nowadays, and they were still able to feed themselves and their family. So can us. So can we. So building the soil and experience to use as you grow and expand. So you're not going to waste any time or effort. Sure, you may lose some plants, you may lose a crop, but again, that's going to go back to that experience, and it's a safe place to start with little cost. Low tunnels and frost blanket or greenhouse film. Simply having something that you can put over your crops to cover with a frost blanket and possibly greenhouse film if it's going to get really nasty. It's not wasted infrastructure because you can still use that in the spring whenever you might see a bunch of insects coming. Put insect netting on those tunnels. And if it's the dead of summer, you can cover it with some shade cloth to protect the plants and even extend some of those late season crops that you're planting now for the wintertime. As you're going into the summer production, you can extend that out just a little bit longer. So low cost with low tunnel hoops, you build it once and you have it forever kind of thing. Maybe not with PVC pipe. That's why we really push using EMT and more permanent pipe. Easy to build, install, and use. They store nice. They deploy quickly. They also support single or double layer frost blanket. And I say frost blanket, but again, insect netting, shade cloth, you can put multiple things on the hoops. It's an economical place to start with infrastructure that will serve you for years as you expand and allows for more crops for better yields. So think about this is year one for you, but you do plan to maybe buy a hoop house at one point. That doesn't mean that you have to get rid of these low tunnel hoops. It just means that you're expanding your plot or moving those in for a microclimate. Hoop houses can move you up to true growing zones further south than what you are in a lot of cases. We do have DIY economical kits all the way to our all-metal kits that are made in the USA and can be highly optioned. They can tailor it to we really encourage people to call up our tech team and kind of work through that for your climate, your budget, your crops, and your growing method. And it's a maximum protection for your plants. Again, without a heater, there's other things you can do with the heater, but we're getting into crops that typically people aren't doing at the market gardener level or that you're just starting out with. So we're going to kind of skip over that for now. But it's an investment into a serious hobby, food security, and your farm's ability to thrive. So just because you're a market gardener doesn't mean that you can't use or deserve a small hoop house in your backyard. About 2 months ago, we had a webinar very similar to this in which we covered that kind of thinking extensively. That's on YouTube. And again, our tech team is available all the time. So now we're going to take a look at how frost forms and basically how it damages crops along the way, again, out at Paris Natural Farms. I like telling you guys where this is just because it's a good insight as to, okay, these things are actually out in the field and being in use, and it's fun to share the success stories of our farmers along the way. This picture is at Tracy's. Again, back to Kansas City Garden Guy, sends us a lot of great pictures, and you can see that's frost on a hoop house. Typically, once the sun comes up, that's going to melt off pretty quick, but that frost could have been on a plant. So let's take a look at how frost forms. When the temperature drops low enough for water vapor in the air to transition directly into ice without passing through the liquid phase. So all that moisture on the air, it's kind of covering everything. So think of like a dew, but it's on the leaf and it's already starting to do the damage. This occurs on a clear, calm night when the ground loses heat rapidly. So the cloud cover, even though it's way up in the sky, as the sun goes down, the heat just zips out of the ground. So think about in the summertime, right? Asphalt, super hot. And then when you go outside after the sun goes away, it gets hotter. That's because once that sun goes down, it's starting to release all that heat. Ground does the same thing. So as it loses that heat rapidly, it basically starts chilling everything, right? And so the high humidity can increase the likelihood of frost. Likelihood, it's not guaranteed to happen all the time. That's why we have to have a little flexibility as far as farmers and growers. But when these conditions come together, Frost can form on surfaces like leaves, posing a risk to plants. Let's take a look at how that actually hurts the plants. This is a scenario on what plants look like after a frost and the sun comes out and it kind of thaws out. It looks like this. It's not good. So the leaf tissue is damaged by the ice crystals that form inside of the plant cell and on the leaf. These ice crystals can puncture the cell walls because, remember, as plants or anything with water freezes, it expands a little bit. When things expand that they're not meaning to, things tend to break. It leads to leakage of the cell contents. What a plant would consider blood, all of the liquid that's going in there, and it breaks down the cell structure. Leaves also look wilted and burn and can stop the plant from growing properly. If the frost is severe, it can kill the plant or significantly reduce its ability to photosynthesize, impacting crop yield and quality. The other thing that's not mentioned there is so much of what you're going to be growing this time of year is a leaf, a harvestable leaf. And if that brown or black or dead or unused, you're starting to lose pounds that you can actually sell at the market. So you're reducing your yield already. So if we take a look at a frost blanket, we do have some frost blankets that were hoops that we're onboarding very soon. It's a little bit early. Probably even shouldn't be saying that, but want to get you excited. But we do have some ready-made options that are coming your way, probably within the next month or so. But we're really well known for our hoop benders. We took that same methodology and brought it down to our USA-made hoop benders for a 4-foot or a 6-foot low tunnel hoop. So here, Paris Natural Farms, again, Carl Binger bending his own hoops, and you can see some of that. Basically, are just put in little rebar pins that are in the ground. They leaves in there permanently. So if a frost is coming, and as all farmers and all growers do, we all have lives, we get busy, and we will be putting out those the afternoon or the night before a frost. And so this next picture just kind of gives you an idea of low tunnel hoops would look like if you bend it yourself with that 4-foot bender. So it's roughly 3 foot, 10.5 inches tall, and then 4 foot wide. So that orange kind of graph I put over the top of that is basically meant to remind you that it's not only the air mass that's getting protected, but it's the frost from forming on the leaf because it's forming on the frost blanket. And again, it's protecting the roots. So giving yourself a little bit of that air mass and a little bit of insulation from the roots, highly important. Easily put on with snap clamps. Again, this is a picture of one of our DIY hoop houses in the background, frost blankets in the foreground. This was lettuce, and they've been able to tie it down with a little bit of string and a tent pole to kind of give it that caterpillar look, and then some cinder blocks. And then that far right corner, I like these two pictures because that's some frost blanket from way back in the day when I first started. But we have this new frost blanket, and I really like it. It has these little perforations in there, and it doesn't allow the condensation to go all the way through, but it does let it percolate down, so you're not having to worry about your tunnels drying out or anything like that. It also lets that warm air kind of breathe, which means you're not building up humidity. I really like this frost blanket that we have. Because I think crop selection is the most important part of that, I did want to bring Randy on. Randy worked for one of the big seed suppliers, again, for Randy, how long were you there?
13 years. I know early on, at one point you were buying seed from me for your farm, and kind of kicked off our relationship, which is I often think back on.
Randy's been to a lot of farms, and so basically in this section, I'm going to interview Randy a little bit and to kind of get you guys thinking about some of the questions that you're going to have the opportunity to ask us. And we're almost done with this presentation. I'd like to leave a lot of room for your Q&As. Again, being able to help with your specific question is going to help other farmers, so don't be shy. And remember to tell us where you're from. We're going to talk about, Randy, what crops do best, and we're going to talk about value by square foot. You've preached this to me for a long time. I really like it. We're going to talk a little bit, we can talk about tomatoes and stuff, but we're going to steer this more towards some of the winter crops because this is the time of year that we're talking about that. And basically leaving your own, I don't know how you say this other than, the things you want to do may not necessarily be what's right for your market. So if you had to advise a new grower on some of the crops for the wintertime, what would you tell them?
I definitely want to look at, as we've talked about before, Nick, like days to maturity, plants per square foot, or yield per square foot, right? So again, if we're talking somewhere, we're thinking tomatoes, right? A lot of fruit in a square foot, high value, right? As we go into winter, and we start thinking about winter crops, yes, we can all probably go into our grocery store and find Brussels sprouts most times of the year coming from other countries and so on and so forth. But Brussels sprouts are typically a fall and winter crop as they mature and are harvested for Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday markets and things like that. But that doesn't make that Brussels sprout a good candidate for overwintering or extending in your tunnel if you need 3 feet of spacing between plants, and that Brussels sprout might be 120 or 150-day crop in there, right? That's a lot of time. That's a lot of square footage. And what may be your best ground or your high dollar real estate, right? These structures can be a little pricey. And so every crop in there's got to pay rent. When I think of crops, I think of high value crops or crops that can have tight spacing or crops with quick turns or crops that benefit by when they're blemish free. And so when I think blemish free, like you can make more money on a flower when it's clean and pristine and doesn't have any blemishes, doesn't have any water spots on it, versus maybe a flower that's grown outdoors that does have those water spots or insect damage, right? That's the lens at which we're looking through this and trying to solve what am I putting in my hoop house? What do I put in my low tunnels? What am I putting under frost blankets? Specific crops that I like to focus on, leafy greens typically do well. They hold themselves really well when we start losing day length. And as long as we can kind of keep the frost off them or keep them from freezing, thawing, like an example in Texas, right? You'll get those frosts in the wintertime, but then you also get those warm temps during the day. So what crops can kind of still perform under those kind of conditions, right? We look at root crops, carrots, kohlrabi, rutabagas, things that typically onions, a great example, are things that can overwinter really well.
I'd like to make a point on those root crops in that just because it's underground and protected, at least the harvestable part, there's two things to think about. Is if you have that damage from frost to the leaves, that plant's not going to do as well. So you still need to protect undercover or in a hoop house kind of thing. And the other example that I like that you mentioned earlier about real estate and space, I always like to think about if you have a hoop house, what could do better outside than that would be in a hoop house? And my specific example is some of the bigger heads of cabbage, right? They can take frost really well. The outer leaves are not going to be harvested anyway, and they tend to be huge with a lot of wasted leaves versus exactly what you just said, quick turn, cut and come again lettuce, head lettuce that can be grown in succession, that you're able to grow 4, 5, 6 heads of lettuce in that same amount of space that you would do a cabbage, that the cabbage is actually going to do better outside and become sweeter anyway. So that's one of those indications of proper crop selection in a hoop house, maybe not under a low tunnel. I'm talking about some of the root crops specifically and some of the leaves that they'll need to photosynthesize and grow versus a cabbage that can really take that hit, and it's quite costly to cover anyway.
If we also think about our markets and where does these crops go to, if they're going to their kitchen table, it might be your personal preference. Let's say you're selling leafy greens to a local restaurant, right? We know there's a salad on every menu in every restaurant in this country. So can we keep leafy greens going to that chef, to that restaurant 10, 11, 12 months out of the year? If you can retain that contract, if you can retain that buyer of your crop all year long, you don't have to wrestle back to win that account back in the spring because you never lost them over the winter, right? So that's a great way to keep that account active for you all 12 months out of the year with those cut and come again leafy greens that you'll have in your hoop house that another grower may not.
We often talk, especially in the summertime, we talk about hoop house varieties, especially with fruiting, vining crops. Is there anything we need to consider on a hoop house specific variety when it comes to this type of year and those types of crops?
You brought up a perfect example, right? Carrots. The majority of the plant is underground, protected. We still have those leafy tops, right? Even under frost blankets, one of the reasons why we still want to use an actual smaller hoop inside our hoop house with frost blankets is we don't want that frost blanket rubbing on the top of the plant. Those greens on that carrot still need to survive. And so you don't want them coming in contact directly with that frost blanket. Any moisture could leach through it. And now you've got stagnant water sitting on plant material, right? Which is a recipe for disease. So good care varieties for hoop or season extension might have shorter tops on them. And that might be a question for your seed rep or your seed company. It might look like days to maturity. As we plant maybe in September, we get a couple of good weeks of growth. We start to lose day length. That plant is going to slow down and kind of go dormant. And then we want to pick back up in the spring when that daylight increases again. And so we might be looking at shortest days to maturity. So which carrots are going to mature the fastest to a marketable size. And so we might look at that.
Here's the other thing, if you don't mind, on carrot tops in particular. So both of the pictures in this was my farm in Paris, Texas, and those carrots came right out of the ground. Earlier, I mentioned that I did a lot of added value stuff. We did a lot of cooking on our farm, and that was our distribution method. Carrot tops were huge for us, both in carrot top pesto as a high value added value, and then we also did a lot of carrot top hummus. So carrot hummus with the tops, both as the main ingredient for flavoring and as the garnish. It was a very valuable part of the crop other than the root. So if we're talking about protecting it is good for the plant in certain situations, and for some more creative home chefs and for sure some of the chefs that you're dealing with at a restaurant, if you're selling, they're going to be interested in the whole entire part of the plant.
And it's an indicator that it's fresh, right? When you buy bagged carrots coming from who knows where at the grocery store, they don't have tops on them. When they're bunched, it's a sign that those carrots might be more recently harvested. They might be fresher. They might be in season. They may be local. Those are a lot of things that you're not getting when you're buying carrots without those tops, right? So it's an indicator for the shopper. These might be a fresher carrot, but just in general too, we know. Even in the winter time, there is that temperature difference inside the structure from inside and out. That's going to start to lead to condensation. That's going to have big spikes in humidity. And so we need to look at varieties that can tolerate that, even with a particular group. So an example might be lettuce varieties that have resistance to downy mildew and powdery mildew. Those are plant diseases that tend to occur in very wet conditions or humid conditions, right? So if a variety has a natural resistance to that disease, that's a variety we're going to want to look at. And some of your seed companies will actually call those disease resistances right out. It could be things like bacterial leaf spot. It could be things like blossom end rot, some of these conditions. So you'll want to look at those by variety in those crops that are susceptible to those specific diseases. Again, your seed rep should be able to help you. And most reputable seed companies, and I don't care if you're looking at Johnny's or High Mowing or Osborne or Seedway, most of their catalogs will list those varieties out with disease resistances so you can shop for them. Some of them call out, I noticed on High Mowing's webpage today, you can shop by hoop house varieties. You can do the same thing on Johnny's website. And you can also shop by days to maturity as well. So what are the fastest maturing varieties? I also look at compact plants, right? So again, everything has to earn its keep. So I'm going to be more interested in a head of lettuce that maybe has an 8-inch head versus a 10-inch head. When I start crunching the numbers, I might be able to get 50 more heads of lettuce inside my structure or 100 more heads of lettuce. And all of those plants add up back into my wallet at the end of the season. So the size of the plant plays a big role there too.
So I want to cover the next one kind of quick because I think we covered a lot, but I'm always, before I started all this and all the traveling, and I think you'll have a better context in that as you go and as you see different farmers do things differently across the U.S., have you seen that not everyone's season is the same, even within a state, and we're thinking about how growers extend their season differently. Can you just give us like a Oregon, Seattle versus Florida versus Northeast versus maybe what California is doing, just very briefly, and that way, if people are in some of those places, maybe things to look out for as they're driving around, or at least that's more applicable to their region.
I think kind of best ways to think about that, right, is lettuce is not very heat tolerant. It's going to want to bolt. It's hard to germinate, right? So a season extension for a southern grower might be how can I grow some of these heat sensitive crops in the summertime? What that may look like for you is maybe it's a structure that has shade cloth on it. Maybe it's a structure that only has shade cloth on it and no plastic. So you're not trapping any hot air. You're not getting those big heat gains throughout the day, but you're still getting the benefit of shade. And that could be over low hoops. That could be over taller hoops or a cat tunnel or a hoop house without any plastic on it. For northern growers, that might be how do we mitigate these harsh winters? How do we keep snow off the structure? What some of that looks like for those growers might be low hoops with frost blankets still inside your structure. So if we think, okay, we're getting about 10 degrees warmer inside the structure than outside ambient air. And if we're getting 7 or 8 degrees warmer underneath that frost blanket, when we start layering up and say, okay, we're using frost blankets on low hoops inside the structure that's already warmer than the outside, we can start making significant differences in keeping that freeze thaw cycle from happening every night and kind of destroying plant tissue.
That kind of lets me bring up. We did a 4-part low tunnel series last year. It's on YouTube. If you just go to our channel, subscribe while you're there. But if you type in low tunnel, there's 4 parts. We're actually talking about layering different weights of frost blankets. So using a 1.5 with a 4 or a 2.5-inch blanket, depending on the crop, depending on the time of year and what the weather's doing. That's also an option for everybody for those. We brought up multiple layers earlier, but it's a good reminder to bring that back up. On perennials, let's go ahead and move on to that. I like perennials for the locality of it, especially when we're thinking about herbs and things like that. Just a quick hit answer on this one. As you've gone to other farms, and you've seen woody stem, rosemary, thyme, oregano, that kind of thing, things that are typically going to come back. Are you worried about covering that up? Or is that a mulch option for you?
That could be a mulch option. Part of that's going to depend on your zone and a little bit of your market, right? Rosemary is a pain in the butt to germinate from seed. It's incredibly difficult. So if you can milk or nurse that plant through the season or get multiple cuttings off it over the course of a year or 2 or 3, that's fantastic. So some of those might look like planting in containers when space is at a premium. Maybe move that container outside. It's going to do great out in the open air. Doesn't need any babysitting or hand holding. But once winter starts to come and we start seeing those frosts, that might be a container that you can easily move inside your structure. You're still getting sunlight. You're still keeping that plant alive, keeping the frost off it, but you can kind of go back and forth. Something that may be in a bed, it might be chives. That's something I would probably throw a frost blanket and low hoops over, and I can get multiple cuttings over multiple years off a bed of chives and things like that. So you just want to be careful that anything super woody doesn't overtake your hoop house. Some people have this urge that they've got prized roses, or they really love raspberries, and so they want to put them in their hoop house. But keep in mind, those things take up a ton of space. Some of those woody branches can poke holes in plastic. So you just want to be cognizant what you're putting into your structure, what maybe you're moving in and out. And we can also kind of change the definition of what a perennial is. Like, you can start hot peppers, some of these super hots, these Trinidad scorpion peppers, things like that. Again, start that in a container, leave it outside, bring it inside. Pepper plant can very easily become a perennial that you can get multiple years off if you treat it in that way. And come year 2, 3, 4, it's going to start looking more like a tree and less like a pepper plant. Great way to handle that too.
So these next 4 are just meant to be some quick answer kind of things. I'm going to skip the crop rotation and succession strategies. A couple of weeks ago, we put out a pretty extensive video on that. If we don't answer all the questions, just answer or ask those in the comment section, and I promise we'll get back to you. So I do want to give one thing to think about, and I'm going to use kale as the plant that we're talking about in this, and that there is within kale, right, as the plant itself, but there's multiple varieties of kale, many multiples of variety of kale, and depending on where you're at, there are different cold hardinesses available in some of those crop selections. And especially if you're in a place like Texas where it's going to start out hot, it's then going to get cold, and then it's going to get freezing cold for like an hour, and then it's going to start getting warm again. And the notion of we're going to start the season with one kale, succession plant with another, and then succession plant with another as those temperatures drop and as they swing back up again.
A common thing, again, if we're specifically looking at kale in general, lacinato types of kale. So those would be what some people refer to as like dinosaur kale or Toscano kale. These really flat single leaves can be incredibly heat tolerant. Down in Texas, they tend not to get bitter like some of those colder varieties would be in the middle of summer. So, maybe you start with a Toscano kale or a dinosaur kale. Again, you can, different names, different seed companies, they're all lacinato types. Maybe you start there. Middle of season, maybe you're looking at things like a star boar kale or a double curl. How wrinkled is the leaf? And then at the end, maybe you're looking at things like winter boar kale, a kale that's specifically bred to be cold hardy, great performer. But you've got an early kale, quick maturing, works in the heat. You've got a mid-range variety that's going to maybe yield a little better. And then you've got something that'll take you all through winter and early spring if you kind of time your harvest out correctly. And again, these are conversations you can have with your seed company, you can have with your sales reps. I encourage everyone to build relationships with the people that work at the companies that you're dealing with on a regular basis, but any major seed company should be able to show you the days to maturity and the slotting for different varieties and why you would use one over another in a different market, different time of year.
So if people wanted to do, before they made that relationship with their seed rep, and they wanted to start searching seed varieties, specifically, where would they find how hardy some of these are, or at least how cold can they get? I'm going to just suggest the specification part of, if you go to one of the major seed suppliers and you click on kale and you click on star boar, and then you can click on the specifications, that's generally where that's going to be. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So a lot of it's in the product descriptions. We would kind of often joke that we spend a lot of time reading a seed catalog to the customer on the other end of the phone, because there's a lot of information in there. And seed companies are starting to do a better job of labeling them with particular symbols that'll demonstrate which ones are cold hardy or which ones are heat tolerant. Some seed companies you can actually filter right on their website for high tunnel varieties or cold tolerant varieties, filter by disease resistance. So again, when we talked about lettuce, looking for downy mildew resistance, or in tomatoes, we might be looking for, leaf mold or blossom end rot. You should be able to search those on the website, or read the descriptions or look at the symbols and disease codes on those. And again, all major seed companies, and when I say major, I'm talking national level seed companies that, your Johnny's, your High Mowing, your Osborne's, your Seedways, your Rups, they all should be able to be searchable in that way, or filterable.
Cool. Well, I'm going to skip the final thoughts because we need to open this up to the Q&As. So, Ricky, if you can go through, and I'm going to answer questions until we run out, but basically if you can read those to me, and hopefully with the location, and Randy and I will do our best to answer.
Hoop house question. When it comes to building your hoop house, do you recommend PVC or metal?
Let's just call it what it is. PVC is very popular. It's very economical. The thing to keep in mind is I always like to think about is this designed to be outside? Is this designed to bend in such a way that it's going to form a hoop? And PVC is meant to go straight and make a connection with another piece of PVC to make a corner or to do a 90 or something like that. There's a reason those fittings are there. And so if we have polyvinyl chloride PVC pipe that is outside, it's not meant to be outside, it doesn't have the UV inhibitors, it's going to break down much faster. And look, some folks, I mean, let's just call it what it is. There's a lot of folks that have used these year over year, no trouble. My whole thing is, if we're going to go through the trouble of planting a crop, tilling up the soil, going through everything that Randy just talked about getting the right variety, and then at the last mile, just pull back just a little bit, a few dollars on every single piece of pipe, Murphy's Law is going to say that thing could fail whenever you need it the most. And it could fail during a cold snap, and it could break, and your frost blanket could fall off. It could break and tear the frost blanket, and then you have to repair the frost blanket, and you for sure didn't save any money. Having a PVC splinter is no fun from a safety standpoint. And then I don't really want to get into, the leaching aspect of PVC, does it or does it not? The threat is there. I don't care for it. So if we use EMT, again, I could also be accused of, hey, this stuff is not designed to be in a hoops in a garden, but this galvanized material that is meant to be outside, at least on the side of a building, holding up and meant to be bent, that's why we've chose to go that route. Now, some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier about we're going to have within the next month or so, that's very purpose designed to be what it is. But if the only option you have is PVC, hey, go for it. Does it work? Yes. Is it the right tool for the job? Probably not. So personal preference, I'm not going to judge you either way. I wouldn't do it for my garden.
And I think it's worth calling out, Nick, like when we were talking about EMT earlier, we're talking low hoops, right? These are structures,
right?
I say structure, but these are things that are 3 feet wide, 4 feet wide, a couple feet tall. There's really no major wind load on these. We're not covering them with expensive plastic that we have to worry about, replacing if things go sideways. If they snow and collapse, you're talking you lost one row. There's a big difference between that and a 20-foot wide structure that's 80 feet long and has thousands of dollars worth of your crop in there and blood, sweat, and tears, and it took you maybe a month of weekends to put it together. EMT for a low hoop, no problem, great idea. EMT for a full-fledged hoop house, super risky.
And look, you can buy EMT at a 1 inch, but just keep in mind that the makeup of the materials is vastly different. It's very soft. It's meant to be bent, and the machines that we build, our hoops on, they're hydraulic presses, and they roll these into place and they roll them into shape. And a little bit of thickness, it goes a long way, but especially the makeup, the composition of the material itself makes a big deal. So, Ricky, what else?
This question is from our friend Anita down in Texas. How do you recommend mitigating heat in a cat tunnel? She just planted out lettuce about a week and a half ago, and it's bolting because in Texas, you are still in the 90s, 90 plus this time of year. Yeah.
Anita, how you doing? Anita's a good friend of ours too. So that's exactly right on the bolting of the lettuce. It could be, I don't know what variety you planted, but if it's one of the lettuces that do better in the cold, it would be prone to bolting. We're still, I mean, you're what, an hour and a half south of where we are. It's still blazing hot down here. So given the fact that it's bolted, I'm just going to make a lot of assumptions that, that's probably been in the ground a long time. Those roots shot up, the bolts happened. And that's going back to that circle I had over Tracy's little brain there. He's learned to time that out a little bit better. I know getting that up for you this year, it was a big thing to get up, and the excitement may have took a hold a little bit before holding back just a little bit when that crop could have been better. But specifically on your question, On our cat tunnels, it has those butterfly doors, raising those up all the way, and possibly even leaving those up at night if there's not a storm coming. Using the side curtains to come up against the batten strap to fully ventilate side to side and the tops and back. You could also do things, and I can't remember on your order if you had shade cloth or not. Also, if you're trying to force a crop into more of a shoulder season situation, which we're talking about, putting a floating row cover of shade cloth over there also could have helped. One of those things, just a lot of varieties, but I think this time next year, the success rate that you're going to have is going to be far greater than what you had this year. I know personally your story, there's a lot of stuff going on this year, and I think a little bit of planning, feel free to call up. But yeah, I think that's the major part of it, is just maybe planted a different variety too early. And again, I'm making a lot of assumptions, as we have to do in stuff like this.
So super quick recap, right? It might be variety. So looking at heat tolerant varieties, I saw Ricky mentioned Muir, which is a Batavian type. Those typically do really well in the heat. Tropicana, again, a nice loose leaf type, does typically really well in the heat. Nick talked about shade cloth. We talked about roll up sides. Another thing I like to look at for lettuce and tunnels is on white landscape fabric. So that's going to reflect some of the light away from the root zone of the plant, and your soil is actually going to be cooler. So if you're trying to heat the soil, black fabric is a great way to heat soil up when you want that heat, and white fabric is a great way to reflect that heat and keep the soil cool. And you'd be surprised what just a couple of degrees difference at the root zone of the plant will do for keeping sensitive crops like lettuce from molting.
And that couple of degrees is exactly what we're talking about on frost blankets. I mean, we're just a degree or two combined with multiple layers, 4 or 5 degrees if you're lucky. Again, it's more about keeping that moisture off the leaf, but just that little bit of heat compared to what you could do outside or what another local farmer can do without frost blanket, big difference. All right, Ricky, what you got?
Next question is, why a high tunnel versus a hoop house? And this person means the taller hoop houses versus the more old-fashioned ones that are maybe only 10 or so feet wide.
I designed the original version of the hoop house that Bootstrap Farmer does in the all metal. I specifically insisted on, I'm 6'1", I don't want to bang my head, so I wanted a taller structure. All of our structures are generally 2 to 4 foot taller than a lot of the other structures out there from other companies, because I wanted that air mass. So low tunnel, let's say it's 10 feet, right? And whenever that sun comes up, it's going to heat that tunnel. The lower it is, the more it's going to spike the heat, and the quicker it's going to dissipate the heat when the sun goes down. That extra height that we have, and if we talk about a high tunnel versus a hoop house, there's all this vocabulary that gets thrown around. But basically, the bigger the air mass, the more of a buffer that you have from temperature swings. And that's why, big commercial growers, they tend to go 30 foot and sometimes wider on their hoop houses. And the smaller it is, the less air mass you're going to have. And it's not that it's going to be so detrimental you're not going to have a crop, right? But it's those incremental changes that make a big difference between growers that are doing this hot and heavy, day after day, year after year in full production, serving multiple markets, often under contract, that it's worth it to go a little bit bigger. But if you're constrained with the budget, or you're constrained with space on the property, or it just doesn't fit for your operation, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. You're doing what you can do, and these things may or may not come in time for you, but the bigger the air mass, the more protection that you're going to have, not only with that ambient temperature on the inside coming and going, but as Randy pointed out, the root zone being so important, that heat is going to stay in that ground a little bit longer because it doesn't have that temperature swing that the inside air is doing. And I forget we do all these videos, right? Sometimes I forget the ones we did last week, but we do have a video on YouTube that specifically talks about air mass because it's very important to me. We talk about how that air moves in and about in a lot more detail in there.
And not to get caught up on the vocabulary, because there's a lot of synonyms and different companies use different terminology, but we may also be thinking too the difference between like a hoop house and a cat tunnel And like our hoop houses, they're coming with hip boards, they're coming with footboards, they're coming with end walls versus a caterpillar tunnel or just a high tunnel may not have hip boards. They may not have footboards. They may not have any end walls or doors at all. And so some of that's preference for accessibility and ease of rolling up a side. Some of it is a major structural integrity, right? Those hip boards, those footboards, they keep the structure stiff, they keep it from flexing. And so when we're talking wind and snow, they're going to hold up night and day, head and shoulders, more so than a caterpillar tunnel that may not have hip boards, it may not have footboards, it might not have purlins. And those are all major structural upgrades.
Look, and this is why we're so proud of our tech team and our customer service team, is they can help you answer these questions ultra specific to your area, your grow, what you're doing. They can ask you probing questions to pull that information out of you that you may not get if you're just banging around on the internet. So information's free. We'll talk to you all day long and make sure you get what you need to fit your budget, but to also fit your strength and what's going to be best for you long term. So yeah, just give them a call, and if you have any specifics, let it rip.
Fourth and last question is from Phil in Canton, Texas, Zone 8B. His question is about Arctic Satsuma. He's wondering if he needs a frost blanket inside. He has a 13 by 35 foot by 7 foot tall hoop house.
We can look at this a couple ways. If the structure is 13 by 35 feet and 7 foot tall, we would just need to know how wide of a frost blanket are you looking for? Are you looking to just basically cover the tree, or are you looking to go over the entire structure? I would probably recommend going over the structure with plastic itself, and we could talk about going with a frost blanket over the tree, but that could be a little challenging. This might be a scenario where maybe we're better off going with a double layer of plastic with an inflator fan in between, just because it's going to be potentially challenging to get extra protection right at that tree and how bulky it may be.
All right. Do we have any follow-up questions?
We have one last question, and I'm also going to send, since we have an awesome article on it that we just updated, but is from Kate Nelson. What direction should the tunnel be positioned? And Kate, I'm also going to drop a resource article for you as well, in addition to this quick answer.
I really like this question. It comes up a lot, and I give it two ways. Textbook is anything above the 40th parallel, so just take Kansas City, draw a line. Anything above that, the textbook says run east to west. Below that, run north to south. There's all this talk about as the sun is lower in latitude, higher up, and higher in latitude coming up, that it gives some calculations on the amount of available daylight coming in and evenly hitting on the crops. Then we also have to take into account, well, what are the crops? So if we have a vining crop that we're going to put on a trellis and it's going to shade things out, that may also come into play. Here's the non-textbook answer, and I think Randy will give me an amen on this, is we've been to hoop houses all over the place. I've been on property where there's a hoop house north to south, east to west, diagonal, in a hole. I mean, I've just seen it all, right? And if there's along the coastline of Spain, there's this whole province, and if you Google Earth It or Apple Earth It, whatever, you can look, and it's just hundreds of acres under plastic, and these hoop houses are going every which way possible. I realize that when you're looking for a hoop house, all of these things, you want to make sure that if you're going to do the investment, it's worth doing right. A lot of times you may be constricted with your land. So let's say you had a long piece of land and you had the room for it to only go one way without it interfering with a utility easement, with a bad drainage situation, with a tree line, with the road, with a weird neighbor. Like, all of this stuff comes into play. So given the fact that I've seen this over and over and over again, no matter where I go, that hoop houses are misaligned with where they should be. In fact, one of the bigger growers in Texas that we spend a lot of time with, everything textbook is completely opposite of what it should say to do. And they're just growing fantastic, and they're growing year over year, and it matches what the requirements of their land. So they can only do one thing. So if you have all the room in the world, below the 40th parallel, north and south, above it, east to west, But again, it's one of those things I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over at night, because historically, over and over again, I've seen it work both ways and even diagonal.
I would second that in a heartbeat. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes the room isn't an issue. Sometimes it's not the easement. Sometimes it's not the where your water lines. Sometimes it's where's the ground the levelest. You don't want 2 feet difference in height from one end of the structure to the other, and so it might be where is the ground the flattest. It might be how many steps would it be to the front door, and you're worried about labor and how many trips you're going to have to make with a wheelbarrow back and forth from your pack shed to the structure. It might be, and this happens more often than not, after you build your first structure and you're making serious money coming out of it, you're going to want a second one or a third one. And where are those going to go? And so Nick's right. There's a textbook answer here, but that textbook doesn't account for property lines and fences and shade from the tree nearby. And what happens if you want a second one next year or a few years from now? Keep in mind, however tall the structure is, you probably want that much space between your first one and your second one. So you're not shading each other out, and you've got room to mow and move snow and all of that. So take those things in consideration as well. At the end of the day, you really can't go wrong, and that's really the answer here.
And folks, these textbook answers, it's really hard when you're talking to people from all over the country in a situation like this, and we're talking about what are you going to plant in your fall garden, and we're talking about market selection and variety and all the factors that come into play. You're searching out textbook answers in the preliminary. But what I've always encouraged everybody to do is, yes, there's Facebook groups. I take all that with a grain of salt, because you're getting all these people that have their definitive answer, and they're very passionate about their answer, and that, well, I've been doing this for 10 years, I must be right. And they most likely are for their situation and their market and all the stuff that we've kind of covered in that, but they may not be right for you. And so that experience that you're going to gain over time and the confidence that you're going to have in your failures as they all add up and get less and less, and talking to other local farmers, I rarely come, growers especially, like at a hobby level, but farmers locally, they're really not going to not talk to you or give you bad information, or unless you just get some curmudgeon that's at the market and has that limited mindset. You're going to get good information from your local extension agent, from a fellow farmer, farmer's market, perhaps even on social media if you meet a farmer local to you. That's why I always encourage people to put where their farm is located in their bio pic, please, but because it all adds up and it all matters. So textbook is great and it's a good starting point, but think about all those factors that in this particular question where we're talking about property lines and where your barn is versus where your pack shed is and where all that's going to be. There's no way any book or any one person, including us, can factor all that in for you. Now, we're here to talk to you afterwards, if you want to send us a picture or something like that, maybe kind of give you some guidance. But there's a lot of those probing questions I mentioned earlier our tech team is likely to ask. It's based off experience of talking to hundreds and thousands of farmers, depending on who you talk to, that they know the questions asked because they've seen this come up time and time again. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to come and learn. We do have some other webinars that we're working on scheduled for heavy November, heavy December, and into the next year. But again, tech team, customer service, they're here 7 days a week. Happy to answer your questions. Hit us up on social, and I sure appreciate it.